My guest today is Robert Davis. He is the author of Supersized Lies, which I got to say, from recent nutrition-focused books, which I've gotten mostly away from reading in recent history. It just has been like, okay, I'm over this. I have appreciated the concise nature with which he approached a history around diet here in America. So Robert is a health journalist. His works appeared on, we've got some big names here, so I'm feeling a little self-conscious about little BTF here, on Time, CNN, PBS, WebMD, Wall Street Journal. This book is his most recent, but there's also 3 previous books on health. Robert has a master's degree in public health from Emory University Rollins School of Public Health and a PhD in health policy from Brandeis. So we've got some heavy hitters in there too, as well as being a Pew Foundation Fellow. And Supersized Lies, this book that I genuinely think does a great job of exploring the various forces like the news media, social media, our own doctors, general health advice, the fitness industry, of which I rap poetic about often on this show, and the way in which that these forces then disseminate false information and misleading info about weight, how it contributes to our, I don't know if I lightly throw the word around here. I don't lightly throw the word obesity around, and then really dives into that history of advice, much of which is not evidence-based, and how we got here, why weight loss promoters go about their lives the way they do, their promotion the way they do. So we certainly have a lot to talk about, Robert. Welcome to Better Than Fine.
Thank you, darling. It's great to be with you.
I'm excited. I'm excited to see where this goes. So first question, total softball, I promise. Why do you think that our society is in some ways obsessed with dieting?
You know, I think there are a number of reasons. First of all, I think that, our society has come to see, and I talk about this in the book, leanness and weight as a sign of all kinds of things, right? We associate it with success, and we associate it with attractiveness and all kinds of things. And I think that dieting, our obsession with dieting, and the promoters of dieting have tapped into that, the way that we perceive weight. And as I talk about in the book, it hasn't always been this way, right? The fact that we elevate thinness to an ideal is not something that has necessarily been true throughout time. I mean, you look at statues, you look at paintings from hundreds of years ago. It was a curvy figure that was considered ideal, right? And I sort of trace this history that over the 20th century that the feminine ideal, quote unquote, has become thinner and thinner and thinner. And this has been reinforced by media. It's been reinforced by social media, despite the fact that the claims of people, many in social media, that say that we're going to promote body positivity and promote, all sizes and so forth. We still see, and there's studies that show there's still this emphasis on thinness. And so I think that the way that society has defined what is quote unquote ideal has helped perpetuate this obsession with dieting. And I also think the medical community has a lot to do with it too. The medical community, and we can talk more about that, but the medical community has focused on weight loss, I think in many cases at any cost, and BMI, and reaching a certain weight, a certain ideal weight. And so there's been a push from the medical side as well for people to diet and to lose weight. And then you have an industry that's prepared to sell us whatever they can to help us achieve our goals of weighing less. And so I think we have a number of different forces: societal, medical, and then from industrial, if you will, all pushing us in this direction.
Oh, you bring up so many important things there, and we're gonna dive right in. I love that you mentioned this societal flux, right? That if we go back, not just a few hundred years, but even if we go back through certain periods in Greco-Roman history where we have statue examples, like there are so many examples through art and culture that we can see a representation of different physical ideals. Now I know, and perhaps you can speak to this, is the way in which the evidence will then try to follow the trend, right? Like we idealize thinness, we hold it up on this pedestal, and then in many ways, BMI is a beautiful example, right? Like the history of BMI, and I'd love for you to speak to this if you feel comfortable on it, that it was based in life insurance, right? And in selling life insurance. So it was typically going to be a white affluent population. They look to make a norms chart. It's like, okay, the top 15% must be overweight because you're above the bell curve and the norm. Now let's idealize this middle of the curve, but it doesn't actually speak to the quality of someone's tissue. It just speaks to like your relationship to gravity on this planet.
Right.
And now we're leaving out whole big swaths of the population that aren't being included in that original data, but then it's being pawned off to medical professionals as a way to gauge someone's health. And if I understand correctly, and I'd love for you to speak to this too, that then we had research following trying to justify, well, why are those people unhealthy? Just because they're heavier. And then we get this trend line that's continued culturally.
Right.
Do you want to unpack any of that?
Sure. Well, I'll elaborate on what you said about BMI. In fact, the BMI it's an index that was developed by a Belgian mathematician back in the 1830s. And what's crazy about this, it was never intended as a way to diagnose people or to make judgments about people's health or ideal weight or anything like that. It was this mathematician. He wasn't a doctor. He wasn't a medical expert. He developed this essentially to essentially place human beings' weights under a bell curve, is to sort of show the distribution of weights. And that's what it was intended for. It was a mathematical tool, basically, to sort of show a statistical tool to show weights in populations and put them under a bell curve. So that's what it was for. And then it was rediscovered in the 20th century, and then eventually became what it was never intended to, which is a way to assess individuals. And it's something that now has, as we know, is used not only in research to define who is quote unquote obese or overweight, but it's also used by doctors, by trainers, by gyms, by dietitians, all kinds of people. And it's the yardstick that's used. And exactly as you say, the original research was in developing this index was in white Europeans. And yet we use it today somehow to apply to all populations. Of course, we know that everybody's different and all populations are different. And yet there are no distinctions when it comes to ethnicity or race. And there's no distinction when it comes to gender either. So it's the same index applies to men and women. There's no distinction when it comes to age. So a 25-year-old ideally is supposed to weigh the same as a 75-year-old. So there's so many problems with it. And study after study has shown that it's not a great predictor of metabolic health. So people that are labeled as obese can be and often are metabolically healthy, and people that are labeled as normal may be metabolically unhealthy. And so what's interesting to me, and I talk about this some in the book, is why is it that if we have this tool is so imperfect, do we continue to rely on it so heavily? And the main reason is that number one is that it's simple. It involves only height and weight. And number two, there's not a great alternative that's easy to use. Yeah. And that's, so I think by default, it's continued to be the standard, but I think it's led to a lot of skewed results and a lot of skewed thinking when it comes to weight and ideal weight.
Well, and you bring up, I think you hint at some good points here, that if it's not indicative of health, but oftentimes we're using it as a health metric, we're also then reinforcing some of these stereotypes that people with larger BMIs are unhealthy. And in my experience as a personal trainer and as a wellness coach, then oftentimes things are going missed in people who maybe are on the larger end of the BMI scale because the doctor is looking at them and saying, well, you're overweight, just lose weight and you'll be fine. And I can't tell you, I've had clients who've thyroid conditions, major hormonal disruptions, Hashimoto's disease, PCOS, where these things go completely uncared for. And in some cases, those are the very conditions that are leading to the hormonal imbalances that then cause the metabolic dysfunction that then cause the weight gain. But because the doctor is looking at them going, oh, well, you're fat, they completely go untreated.
No, that's a great point. And I think there's no question that goes on. And, you know, the medical community is I think quite guilty. And we can talk about why that is. I think it's biases among physicians in many cases. It's also lack of time. It's much easier just to say, go lose weight, go on a diet, and you figure out how to do it, but just lose weight, instead of, as you say, delving more deeply into underlying issues that may be the real culprit. And yes, and so the consequences are enormous. And I think not only emotionally, but physically for people.
I'm glad to hear you recognize it emotionally, because that has been my experience as a coach. one of the most significant things to unpack with people is the perpetuating of what eventually becomes traumatic for them, that they are not being seen as people. They are just being seen as their, weight. But just now you mentioned, in the doctor's office, this person says, okay, just go bring your weight down. I don't care how you do it. In my experience, they often don't know how to do it. And there's a lot of weird myths around diet and dieting. This is probably the most I've talked about the word diet on this show ever. What do you think is the biggest diet lie that you encounter?
Well, one certainly is the idea that weight loss, weight management is all about specific villains. So if all you need to do is cut out a specific food or category of foods. So you think back to the 1970s and 80s, it was all about fat, right? So fat makes you fat. And so eat low fat foods and you'll be at a healthy weight. That was what we were told. And so what happened? The market was flooded with all kinds of low fat, no fat processed foods. And so people consumed more and more of those foods. And what happened? People actually gained more weight. And we had a diabetes epidemic as well. And then came the next era, which was I call the Atkins era, which is instead of fat, it's carbs. Just cut your carbs. It's all about not eating carbs. And if you don't eat carbs, you'll lose weight. And since then, it's been all kinds of variations on that theme. No gluten, no sugar,
Don't eat at all.
Don't eat at all, detoxify, and the list goes on. But the point is that the idea of weight management or health is what it should be, but the idea of healthy weight has been grossly oversimplified to a matter of not eating a particular food or kind of food. And, people, they lurch from one diet to another. We're egged on by this through the food industry, which keeps churning out all kinds of food in whatever category, whether it's no fat, no carb, no sugar, whatever it is. And they're typically foods that aren't good for us because they're highly processed foods that aren't good for our health. And so I think this to me is certainly one of the biggest myths. And I think it's led to a lot of the failure that people see, failure in the sense that they try diet after diet and they lurch from one to the other that restricts something. And then of course, what also happens is anytime you severely restrict some food, the way our brains work, at least many of us, is that we just crave those foods even more. So we deprive ourselves the ability to enjoy eating, to enjoy our food. And it can lead to an unhealthy relationship with food because then people start craving those foods and overeating them because they aren't supposed to have them.
Well, and I think it also becomes this weird kind of purity, right? Like you threw detoxes into your tick list of fads, and it becomes this dirty food versus the good food. And then I get to identify as the clean and virtuous one when I'm, eating super clean paleo on my keto, paleo, intermittent fasting protocol. As opposed to those who then can't, I think of, 6-8 years ago, Whole30 was very big in the gym I was working in. And people would, do their Whole30 and they'd go through their carb flu. And then on day 16, they'd buckle and have a muffin and they'd have to start over because on that protocol, the Hartwig's protocol, you're, supposed to do 30 days. And if you slip up at all, you have to start over. And psychologically, it's really intense for people who struggle with disordered eating because now they're failing as people.
Right. And I think the failure is the key there to me, because what it leads to is a sense of I'm a failure. I can't follow this diet. I ate a muffin. I ate, chocolate. I had bread, whatever it is that's forbidden. I ate that forbidden food and I'm a failure for doing this. And so it leads to self-blame, sense of, lowered self-esteem and all the rest. And people blame themselves. And the failure is not the individual. The failure is the diet. The failure is on the part of those who are pushing a terribly misguided idea that's not going to work and that's not realistic. And it's not realistic to expect people to follow it over any period of time.
Yeah, you mentioned in your intro that I had built off of this idea that weight loss promoters are clinging to bad advice, what they gain from that bad advice. Can you unpack a bit about, this kind of weight loss promotion industry and what that looks like?
Yeah. And to be very blunt about it, it's about money. And if you look at the weight loss industry, the latest estimate is worth more than $60 billion a year in the US. And that was during COVID. So it's much more now. It's likely 70 or more now. And so, of course, there are a number of players in this industry, whether you're talking about people who push specific diets, saying this is the best diet, follow this diet, whether it's food companies pushing specific foods that are supposedly diet friendly, whether it's supplement makers that make weight loss supplements, whether it's gyms that say join and lose 30 pounds in 30 days, whatever it is, the list goes on. There are a number of players in this industry, and they all obviously all stand to benefit from pushing these misguided ideas that they have the solution. If only you follow, take a pill, exercise, follow some diet, eat certain foods, then you'll lose weight. And the crazy thing about it is that what they're pushing doesn't work. So we keep coming back for more and more and more, and they keep making more and more money, because if it worked, they would be out of business. And so it doesn't work, which is what's, the irony of it is that that's how they keep making more money, because what they're pushing doesn't work.
Two call outs I want to make from your list for the benefit of the listener. If you ever go to sign up at a gym and they promise you to lose 30 pounds in 30 days, the only way they're going to do that is cutting off your limb. Run from them. And also, weight loss supplementation has largely shown to be detrimental in the long run, right? It's not effective to do the things they claim on the bottle, and it actually can cause deteriorating health. So if anyone listening to this, those are two takeaways that Robert and I would like you to have at the bare minimum. You have also mentioned the packaging of foods and other products that make diet claims. You alluded to this like cyclical food packaging. My favorite is the way that like Cheerios used to say heart healthy and now it says gluten free. And I mean, I'm just dropping brand names all over the place in this episode. I'm going to get sued. Anywho, can you speak to a bit about why that is, and the mindful consumer, how they might approach food labeling?
Yeah, we see all these claims, front of the box claims. We're not talking about the nutrition label, which has calories and so forth. We're talking about just other, as you mentioned, things that say gluten-free or low fat or natural or light, whatever the case may be. All these buzzwords, and marketers, they're savvy. They know that these work because they give the foods a health halo. They make the food seem healthful. So you can take what in some cases is essentially junk food, or certainly food that's not particularly helpful, and make it seem helpful. And often this occurs because the marketers, the wording they use focuses on some specific aspect of the food, high in protein, natural, vitamins added, fiber added. Often you'll see high fiber foods that have fake fiber that's not naturally occurring fiber. And so what it does is it causes us to focus on one constituent of that food rather than the overall healthfulness of the food, and to buy that food thinking we're doing our weight or our health a favor, when in fact we're not necessarily. And so it's something that I think consumers, I tell people to ignore those words on the front of the box, because they really are, they're marketing. They're not about science. They're not about informing you. They're about trying to get you to buy the food to make you think that it's helpful. And so what really, if people want to judge the overall nutritional and health value, healthfulness of the food, you need to look at the label, look at the ingredients, and look at the food nutrition label. That's where the more valuable information is to be found.
One of my favorite examples of what you are describing is when you can point to a particular brand, a particular product, and the way in which, as the food trends have changed, they've just reconstituted their formula of what they add to that processing to add in whatever the thing is. Of like healthy fats, more omegas, less fat-free, like same food, just like let's pull the levers on the machine to adjust the ratios of things so that we can legally make that claim. You also mentioned the word natural a number of times. And whenever anyone says like, oh, but it's natural, I say, yeah, so is arsenic, but you're not going to eat that.
Right. And also under law, that term really has very little meaning. Just about anybody can, at least on packaged food, slap that on the box and it doesn't mean anything. There's very little regulation behind that in terms of what that actually means.
So what advice do you give people? Because this is, we're essentially saying like, hey, a lot of the things that you do and hear and out in the ether, I can't tell you how many people come to me and they're just flat confused to the point of essentially wanting to give up, or they're overwhelmed to the point of not knowing where to start.
I would say that when it comes to diet, to focus, it ought to be about health first and foremost. That's what it's all about. And so A diet that is optimal for health is also a diet that over the long term is optimal for a healthy weight. And what does that mean? It means a diet in sort of what the best research shows that we have currently available, a diet that is high in fruits and vegetables and whole grains, uh, seeds, nuts, beans, lean meats, dairy if you consume dairy, and minimizes highly processed foods, things like chips, sweets, soda, fried foods, and foods like that that are highly processed. Foods that when you see the box, got a long list of unpronounceable ingredients on the label. Now, it doesn't mean that you never eat those highly processed foods, because again, this is not about restricting yourself. It's not about saying, I'm going to have these foods that are toxic or poison and never touch them, because that, again, I think often leads to an unhealthy relationship with food. But it just means that over time, we try to nourish our bodies with foods that are good for us, that are going to be good for our health, and we try to eat less of the foods that are not going to be good for us. And this is a process. I mean, I know I went through this process myself. When I was in college, I ate a lot of highly processed foods. I drank a lot of soda. I ate a lot of fries and hamburgers and foods like that. And so I decided in college, though, to gradually start changing my eating habits. And it was gradual, because you can't expect anybody who has a lifetime of eating a certain way to do that overnight. It's not realistic. And any diet that tells people to do that is by definition not going to work, because we take many years to develop our habits, and it takes many years to change the way we eat. But it can be done, and I know from my own experience it can be done. But it's a matter of making small changes, being patient, and focusing always on the overall quality of the food, and not obsessing over any single constituent, including calories. Because I think, my criticism about the diet obsession with calories is that can obscure the larger point, which is how helpful is the food. If you're say choosing between nuts and a fudge bar, the fudge bar may have may have fewer calories than the nuts, but it doesn't mean it's a better choice when it comes to your weight or your health. The nuts may be a better choice because they're going to fill you up more and they give you nutrients that you need. So the point is that in assessing the way to eat, I think it's important to look holistically at food, to look at the overall nutrient density of the food, to look at how nutritious it is, rather than fixating on some individual component of the food.
I'm glad to hear you lump calories in there in terms of calorie fixation. I often find that people who have that same kind of calorie fixation are also fixating on calorie restriction specifically.
Right.
So it is rarely that I encounter like, okay, I'm fixated on getting 2,600 calories a day as opposed to 1,200 calories a day. And whether or not that person metabolically is doing damage by having only 1,200 calories a day. But you have mentioned, I'm trying to think of the phrasing that you use, excuse my end of the day brain. You've mentioned disordered eating, essentially, right? Unhealthy relationships with food. And I know for me, I often take it as a bit of a flag when someone talks about jumping from diet to diet to diet to diet, as you're describing, because to me, that is, I can't just walk into my day and relate to food in a comfortable way, right? This is somebody who is thinking about food a lot of the time, um, straining their relationship with food, with themselves, with their bodies. Do you have any thoughts on the way in which this kind of diet cycling, or the way in which our cultural and social, weird obsession with whether it's leanness or diet contributes to that kind of mindset, and how that then affects health?
Yeah, I have always been aware of this, but I became much more acutely aware of just the detrimental effects in writing the book, because I interviewed a number of people and told their stories. And my quote success stories in this book were not people that have, lost X number of pounds or inches. It was about people who have struggled with diet culture and then found their own way and found a way that worked for them. And those were the success stories that I talked about. But in so many of these cases, it was people who did exactly what you're describing. They lurched from one diet to another diet to another diet, desperate to lose weight. They were either told by their doctors or felt that they should lose weight or needed to look a certain way. And what happened to them is they went on a diet, they lost weight. They regained the weight, many cases even more weight. They went on another diet, lost weight, regained the weight, and often regained more weight than they had lost, which is, again, speaks to how our biology works and the problem with these diets. And the damage but what really I became even more aware of in interviewing these folks is not only the physical toll it took on them, yo-yo dieting this way, but the enormous emotional toll it took. Because what happened each time they, quote, failed, they blamed themselves. They became more angry at themselves. They felt more shame. They had more internalized stigma about, oh, well, I'm all the things that society projects onto people often who are overweight, that you're lazy, you have no self-discipline, this is your fault, all those kinds of very detrimental, false, negative ideas. And they internalized many of these notions even more each time they, quote, failed at some attempt. And again, I think that was what perhaps was more eye-opening to me than anything else writing this book, was just hearing firsthand the terrible emotional, psychological toll that this takes on people.
Well, and then to nod back to the industry that you have been referring to, it is then that, whether we call it fitness or the weight loss industry or whatever label we want to give it to, these predatory, influencer practices, they're preying on that emotional state,
Right.
right? They are people who are looking at that and going, that's a marketing opportunity,
Yep.
which in many ways is just so gross. And this, I want to speak to this effect of, I go on a diet, I drop some weight, I end up heavier than I started. I go on another diet, I drop some weight, I end up heavier than that threshold. And, what that nods to me as a practitioner is the way in which that very restrictive diets just damage the metabolism, right? We know from cohort studies of people who have been the product of yo-yo dieting. I think the best case example is people who are on The Biggest Loser. And we see their metabolisms are just aggressively stunted from the amount of calorie restriction they've been on. They return back to normal living. And because of the lower caloric expenditure in their activities of daily living, their weight goes back up higher than it was before. And their new stasis is the damaged stasis. And then they do it again and again. And eventually we have people who are just in a place of desperation that you're alluding to, the emotional toll taken on them.
Yep. And then I would say that this, if I may, that this reality is often not made apparent to people when we're told the sort of the standard advice. Well, losing weight is simply about, eating less, moving more. It's essentially, restrict how much you're eating and you'll lose weight. And it's completely ignoring this reality of how our metabolism works, that when you restrict calories, your metabolism slows down and all these hormonal changes occur in your body. And the fact that none of that nuance, none of that complexity is conveyed when people are given the standard advice, including from physicians often, is a huge problem.
Well, and that's exactly what I was going to ask you to speak to, because I know, whether I'm talking about professionally or personally, I've been arguing with my dad's doctor for years. My father is 6 foot tall. He is not a small man. His doctor wants him on a 1,200 calorie a day diet. And I refuse. Like, that's going to make it worse.
Yeah.
And then of course, professionally, I encounter this all the time. So from a physician perspective, how do you see them being in this role where they're giving this advice? I'm assuming it's well-intentioned, right? I've always
Sure.
run on the assumption of positive intent from a physician saying, well, just eat less. Where do you see that coming from, having done this research?
I think, well, there are a couple of things. Number one is that they have been trained to believe in the simple calories in, calories out model of weight, that's what it's about. And that most physicians don't have any additional advanced training in nutrition. And so for them, I think they may have a basic understanding of what we're talking about, and there are obviously a lot of smart doctors, but they're focused on other things. They're not necessarily focused on the nuances of weight management. And so it's just easier to fall back on this paradigm, which is sort of age-old paradigm. Well, just eat less, cut your calories, and you'll lose weight, which is true. I mean, it's true in the short term. It's irrefutable. You cut someone's calories to 1,200. Yes, they will lose weight in the short term. But the question is, the issue in healthy weight is not the short term. The question is, what's going to happen over the medium term and the long term? What's going to happen to your weight? What's going to happen to your health? And so this idea, again, that it's simply about cutting calories is so, I think, deeply embedded, not only in society, but also sort of in the medical world as well. And that it's simply about that is really, I think, what's at work there.
Yeah, and not just the medical field, right? I was very excited about the title of your book, Supersized Lies, because I call the big lie of the fitness industry is eat less, move more.
Yep.
Right. Oh, if you calorie restrict and you work out with me, especially if it's calorie restriction and circuit training, I guarantee you that person 18 months from now is going to be heavier.
Yeah.
And it's something I've seen time and again amongst my peers, very early in my career, my own clients. So I guess you've alluded to what an individual might do for themselves in terms of progressive behavior change, eating whole foods, reducing, processed foods, anything you can't pronounce, don't put it in your mouth.
Mhm.
Um, as a society, like this isn't just an individual problem, right? This is also a cultural problem,
Right.
right? We've got aggressive marketing that is very manipulative. We've got our own social conditioning around body ideals. Like if you get, and you literally have the mic right now, two listeners who definitely care. And I would say, since it's a positive psychology podcast, this is people who are invested in the idea of making the world better and improving human well-being. How does that well-meaning person help make this better, even if they personally are like, yeah, I eat all my vegetables, Robert. I have my fish and I go for runs and walks. Like, so they're personally thinking of themselves. How do we as a society try to fix this?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I wish I had a good answer.
Mm,
I don't know if I'm smart enough to answer that question well. I certainly would say that what if individuals want to get politically active, and not everybody does. I mean, they certainly could lobby to restrict the power of the food industry to do what it does, because I think that there's undeniable the food industry plays a big role in this. I think that they can certainly be very aware of the companies they support when it comes to buying foods that they think that are prepared in a way that's consistent with good health, and not buying ones that don't. I think that where possible, to try to educate their physicians. I know that's a hard thing to do. Doctors are not ones to be open to information, but if they're having a discussion, to bring in articles and to say, look, this is here's information I've gotten from a reliable source about my
I've got
work.
a book for you. It's called Supersized Lies.
Yes, exactly. But no, seriously, I think to push back when they can with information, with reliable information, to help those physicians really understand that what they're pushing is not helpful. I quote in the book a physician from Emory who writes an open apology to his patients, and has this epiphany and says, I realize what I've been doing all these years is telling them go on a diet, and when they don't go on a diet, I say it's your fault. Obviously, you didn't try hard enough. Try harder. And the doctor apologizes and says, I've been wrong, and I've realized I've caused terrible pain and suffering by taking this approach. So I think some physicians are, I think, open to learning, and when people can do that, I think they should try.
Yeah. And the open-hearted recognition of when we've been wrong, right? That's what I hear. I like that's a beautiful thing to include. The other thing that jumps out to me, if I might be so bold as to add to your list, is the question of access, right? Like I hear and hear, not everyone can afford like eating primarily fruits and vegetables in a plant-based diet with lean meats that is, organic, and they were petting the chickens when they put them away at night, is expensive. It's way more expensive than the dollar menu at Taco Bell. And there are some people who don't have that access, or they're just in a food desert. And so to me, I also hear the public health recognition that how do we create a system that then also gives access to all of these options in a way that's affordable to everyone, and not just to people who have that kind of stability and affluence.
No, I certainly would agree with that. And one thing I would add to that, though, is that I think with that, you know, increasing education to the extent we can, in helping people understand how they can eat a healthful diet on whatever budget they have. Because I
Mm.
think sometimes there's a misimpression that you have to go to an expensive food store to get designer foods. And I won't name a store. We've already
I've been
named
name
names.
dropping all over this episode. Like I said, Robert, I'm just parroting.
I was about to, but I
You,
won't.
you, I
But
am
you can
impressed
fill
with
in the
your,
blank.
clearly your self-regulation exceeds mine.
So, but the point is that you can find if you know how to do it, and that's the key, right? It's a matter of education, but understanding how to go to any supermarket and find foods that are going to be healthful and filling and consistent with a healthful diet. So that people can learn, but you have to know how to do that. Someone has to teach you to do that, to know how to shop at the supermarket, to find foods that are going to be healthful. So yes, you're absolutely right about the need to do that. But I think short of that, at least helping people make choices with the budgets they do have that are more helpful. And often that's simply just as a matter of education.
Yeah. And also the skills of preparation. I think
Right.
of, the this decline of home economics in our, I think we
Yeah.
need to call it something else, like life skills maybe, but without having a vehicle through which to educate, I couldn't cook in my early 20s at all. I remember my now ex-husband teaching me how to make a grilled cheese sandwich because I used to toast the bread in a toaster, put two pieces of bread, like put two pieces of cheese in between and microwave it so the cheese was mushy. And he taught me how to make a grilled cheese sandwich when I was 22 because I did not know how to cook. So the barrier for entry for me for like preparing an interesting and delicious meal that is plant-based took me another decade to figure out
Yeah.
because I had to learn all of those steps in between on my own. So I think that I just want to recognize that there are many barriers for
Yes.
entry for all
Yeah.
different populations. And it's so easy for us to, as practitioners, to say, oh, just eat a plant-based diet with not a lot of processed food and lean meats and da, da, da. That isn't an easy reality. But I think what I hear you saying, which I appreciate, is it's not about getting to the perfect execution tomorrow. It's what's one little choice that you could be nudging into a better place tomorrow and next week and next month, and that those things accumulate as we understand, better nutrient density and nutrition and getting what your body needs in order to feel good.
Absolutely. And that things like going gradually over time from drinking soda to drinking water, or from, going to eating a candy bar to eating a piece of fruit, or eating fruit that, and it could be frozen fruit or fresh fruit, but things like that are small changes that happen over time.
Yeah. May not be the sexy answer, but that doesn't mean that it's not the right one and the one that works and the one that appreciates and recognizes everyone's humanity.
Right. Right.
I so appreciate you making the time to have this conversation, and thank you for being on the show.
Well, thank you, Darlene. It's been a great pleasure.
Any last words?
I would just say that I think when it comes to people thinking about their weight and their health, that what's important is to really try to tune out the noise, because there's so much noise, and that it becomes overwhelming. And I know that for so many people, my relatives, my friends, there's so much noise, and to stick to the basics, which is to focus on your health. And that's what really matters. And the weight whatever weight is a healthy weight for you will work out, but it's a matter of focusing first on getting healthy. And that's, I think, the key.
Wonderful. Robert Davis, thank you so much for being on the show. The book is Supersized Lies, and it's been a pleasure having you.
Thank you.